Most fantasy football leagues only have 2 or 3 weeks left in their regular season. Right now is the time to either win titles or play spoiler, but either way, we all have something to play for. That's why today, we're talking about Week 13 wide receivers. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today, where yes, the NFL robots that made the schedule have put us in a tough position here in Week 13 with 6 teams scheduled to be on a bye. We're going to be without some big name wide receivers this week. Guys like Stephon Diggs, DJ Moore, Devontae Adams. You're not going to be able to use them. However, we have found a few guys this week in this show today that may be decent fill-ins. Now, 2 quick things before we get into all the matchups. I have to announce a winner of last week's giveaway item, the signed mini helmet of Devontae Adams, the salute to service. Well, we went through all the comments and there were a ton of them, but the one that was randomly selected was Alan Presig, 2631. Congratulations, Alan. All you need to do is send me an email to info@thefantasyheadliners.com and I will get you hooked up. Next, and maybe most importantly though, we need to talk about our Compassion Kids of the Week. Because even though the year is winding down, I am on a mission to try to make the world just a little bit better, and I'm hoping you can help me with that. Now, there are timestamps down below if you choose to skip to certain matchups, but I would appreciate it if you just take a minute and listen to what I have to say. So far, we've had 10 children sponsored here on this channel, and that's great. That's 10 kids that have been taken away from extreme poverty. But unfortunately, the 2 kids that we had in this show last week are still out there looking for a sponsor, and you know what? I'm dedicated to helping these kids find a little bit of help. It's the holiday season, and what a better time to put a smile on a child's face. So let's look at their information here once again. In case you missed it last week, I know it was a holiday. The first one up, though, is little Firo Mesa. He's 4 years old, lives in Ethiopia, and has now been waiting for a sponsor for 347 days. Secondly, it's Liz, also 4 years old, lives in Bolivia, and has been waiting for a sponsor now for over 400 days. Is there anyone out there that is able to help one of these children change their lives? If it's something you think you may be interested in doing, you need to head over to compassion.com/headliners. There's links down below in the description. When you go to that website, you're gonna see a page full of children that are just looking for a little bit of help. As a part of this partnership with Compassion, they've actually given us our own part of the site on their website. The children that you see on compassion.com/headliners are only available to our community, and we need to try to do our best to make sure they have what they need heading into the holiday season. So if you feel like that's something you're interested in, please visit compassion.com/headliners. There are tons of kids out there looking for a little bit of help, and I know this community, once again, is going to step up. But now is some time to talk some football, and we got it on Thursday night, a matchup between the Seattle Seahawks and the Dallas Cowboys. And if you watched my quarterback video earlier in the week, you know that I have some concerns about Geno Smith. Well, if I have concerns about Geno Smith, I'm pretty sure I'm probably going to have concerns about his wide receivers as well, right? I mean, it only makes sense. And I really do have some concerns. But really, what's shocking to me is for the first time in forever, Seattle does not have a wide receiver in the top 30 overall wide receivers in fantasy football. As of right now, DK Metcalf is wide receiver 34, Tyler Lockett is wide receiver 32, and Jackson Smith-Njigba is wide receiver 52. There just seems to be no consistency week in and week out with this offense. As of right now, though, I still feel safest with DK Metcalf, but really, that's just due to volume alone. He's had 9+ targets in 5 of his last 6 games played, which is great. Tyler Lockett, he's only hit that number 2 times over his last 6 games, and JSN hasn't hit that target number all year long. Now they get a tough matchup going up against Dallas. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We also know at the time of this recording, we're still waiting to find out whether or not we get Kenneth Walker back this week as well. Does that overly impact the wide receivers? Not really, because the usage would just go to Zach Sharman. Hey, if they needed to. But this is why I find it extremely hard to sit somebody like a DK Metcalf. As of right now, he is top 12 among all wide receivers in the NFL in deep targets and red zone targets. The guy is a big play touchdown threat each and every week. With him getting around 9 targets a week, it's giving him 9 opportunities at a big play. Not all wide receivers are created equal in the NFL. DK Metcalf possesses that big play ability. Tyler Lockett used to, but now with the addition of JSN in this offense, his opportunities are a little bit more further apart. There's no way that anyone can look at any of the wide receivers in Seattle and say they're some weekly must-start guy. If I had to give the edge to anyone right now, though, it's still DK Metcalf. All right, what about for Dallas? CeeDee Lamb, on the other hand, we already know he is a full-fledged weekly must-start wide receiver. Now, sure, over the last 2 weeks, he's struggled to gain some yardage, but he has found the end zone in both of those games. So from a fantasy perspective, he didn't really hurt you. I mean, it's really just not a question whether or not you start him each and every week. I get that, but I do have to say this. There is a high probability that even though he plays in the slot quite a bit, he's going to get a whole lot of Devin Witherspoon in the slot as well. And that sucks because that young defensive back is a stud. Does that mean he's going to shut down CeeDee Lamb? Probably not. Not too many people can just shut him down, but I'm not looking for a ceiling game here this week. Obviously still going to start CeeDee Lamb, but what about Brandon Cooks? One of my better calls in this show just last week, but what about this week? Because he just doesn't see enough volume week in and week out to really warrant a weekly must-start status. We have to be somewhat selective. So in a matchup here this week going up against Seattle, they allow the 14th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is pretty close to league average. There's no injuries right now in Dallas that's going to affect the passing game, but here is what has me contemplating life choices when looking at the Dallas Cowboys roster. If Devin Witherspoon is in the slot with CeeDee Lamb, there is a good chance that Brandon Cooks is on the outside with Reek Woolen. That is not ideal because Woolen can keep up speed-wise with Brandon Cooks, but is damn near twice his size. I don't see Brandon Cooks getting enough volume to not be touchdown dependent in week 13. I look at him as more of a high risk, high reward type flex play, especially in deeper leagues. When my rankings come out later in the week, he may be somebody who's verged top 30, but not overly high. But now let's head over to some Sunday football. No Friday or Saturday football this week. We got the Chargers and the Patriots up first. We'll kick it off in LA because Keenan Allen is worth talking about first. Can you believe how many people out there told this fantasy community to avoid Keenan Allen in 2023? Yikes. I'm just glad that's not the case here in Headliner Nation. We've been talking about Keenan Allen for what feels like years, and we are all reaping the rewards of his fantasy production here in 2023. Listen to this. He is almost at a career high. So far this season in receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns, and we still have 6 games left in the season. The dude is on an absolute tear. 14 plus targets, 10 plus receptions, and over 100 yards receiving in each of the last 3 games he's played. He's the current wide receiver 2 overall in fantasy football and has only scored under 10 fantasy points in a game one time all year. Now a matchup going up against New England. They allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Quentin Johnston, currently questionable with a rib injury. Dude doesn't do much anyway, and we still haven't heard about the potential return of Josh Palmer. It's getting close. Does it happen this week? Time will tell, but right now it's not looking great. But all that really tells me is that Keenan Allen is going to continue to get force-fed targets till his hands fall off each and every week. The guy is the only wide receiver we're starting in LA, and he's going to be inside my top 5 this week once again. On the other side of the football, we got the New England Patriots, and honestly, I don't really want anything to do with the wide receiver group in New England right now. We have no idea who the quarterback is going to be. Demario Douglas is questionable to even play this week because he got popped in week 12. And the other wide receivers in New England, they average 3 fantasy points per game. Sure, it's a great matchup going up against the Chargers, but there are just way too many unknowns here for me. It's not like Demario Douglas was out there averaging 20 fantasy points per week, and he was some must start, and now we're just waiting to find out if he's available. He was barely averaging right around 10 fantasy points per game as is, and now he has all of this stuff going against him. Unless we know heading into this weekend that he is 100% healthy, and we know who the starting quarterback is going to be, then maybe I will consider him as a low-end flex at best. But when my wide receiver rankings come out, he's probably not going to be somebody who's ranked overly high. Which will then take us out to Nolans for the Saints and the Lions. We'll kick it off in Detroit with Amon-Ra St. Brown because he's really the only consistent option at the wide receiver position in Detroit. We already know he is a weekly must start. He's the current wide receiver 6 overall and has finished as a top 12 wide receiver 90% of his games this season. He's had 9 plus targets in all but 2 games this year and touchdowns now in 2 out of his last 3 games played. In a matchup going up against New Orleans, they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game, but they are without their top defensive back, Marshawn Lattimore. Really no injuries in Detroit that's going to affect the passing game, and the volume and production is just too high here and too consistent that there's no one out there considering sitting Amon-Ra St. Brown. Not the best matchup maybe for him, but Doomtar is worth the risk. All right, what about the New Orleans Saints? And as for New Orleans, we could be in a world of hurt here. Literally. Chris Olave is currently in the concussion protocol. Rashid Shaheed suffered a quad injury in week 12. He left the game, is questionable to play this week. Right now, we don't even know if either one of these guys are going to be active this week or not. Now, if Olave is cleared, we know he's a weekly must-start guy, right? That's not much of a question. But what about Rashid Shaheed? What if he is active? And honestly, he hasn't been much as of late. Only one game over the last 5 weeks with 10 fantasy points or more. Dude is like the off-brand version of Gabe Davis at this point, super hit or miss. In a matchup going up against Detroit, though, it's a good matchup. They allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but it really comes down to who is active. But there is no one in New Orleans, aside from Chris Olave or Rashid Shaheed, that I'm overly considering starting in fantasy football. If both these guys are ruled out, I'm just going to avoid the entire team altogether. If Chris Olave is active, he'll be in my lineup. He's somebody who's going to see a ton of targets. As for Rashid Shaheed, he's going to be a high risk, and I'm stressing this, high risk play if he does play and suit up this weekend. Really, at best, I see Chris Olave being a high-end wide receiver too. Everyone else outside the top 30. Which will then take us out to a matchup between the Jets and the Falcons. We'll kick it off in Atlanta with Drake London, and I would love to trust Drake London. I really would. Maybe I have trust issues. Maybe it's a mixture of this matchup and Arthur Smith's inability to acknowledge the fact that he's lost on offense. But in a matchup going up against the Jets, you have to expect that Drake London's going to be covered in sauce most of the week. And for a wide receiver that really hasn't shown any consistency or anything close to a ceiling in like the last 2 months of the season, that's an absolute issue. With the way his numbers look, he needs huge volume in order to produce for your fantasy football team. Right now, he's outside the top 40 overall wide receivers in deep targets, catchable target rate, yards after the catch, average depth of target, and touchdowns. He's just dinking and dunking his way down the field, and once he gets the ball in his hands, he's not doing much after the catch. And now he gets a matchup going up against the Jets, who allow the fewest points of all teams in the league to opposing wide receivers. We also know at the time of this recording that Mac Hollins still questionable to play, so the target share should be there. But when I look at Drake London, I really view him as a wide receiver that I would consider in good matchups. In risky matchups like these, though, probably not very much. This Atlanta offense just hasn't proven all season long that they can find ways to get the ball to Drake London consistently. A lot of it has to do with bad quarterback play, but in a matchup like this, where he's probably going to see a whole lot of Sauce Gardner, I expect a whole lot of running in this game if I'm being completely honest. It's way easier to run on the Jets than it is to throw on them. And Atlanta has that opportunity and the backs to do it. Now, on the other side of the football, we have Garrett Wilson, and man, I don't know about you, but I am so glad to see Tim Boyle out there playing quarterback again. I mean, at least he continued to look the way of Garrett Wilson last week. That's good. The volume was still there, but it's super easy to see a guy who's really not that far past the line of scrimmage. 10 targets, 7 catches, only 44 yards, but found the end zone, which is great. But that comes out to be only 6.3 yards per reception. He's not going down the field anymore. But what those numbers should really tell you is that Garrett Wilson needs one of 2 things to become fantasy viable week in or week out. He needs a touchdown, or he needs to see at least 15 plus targets a week. Now, I know it sucks, but I didn't invent numbers and I didn't invent math. And I really don't think we can look at Garrett Wilson and see him as a wide receiver that we can count on touchdowns each and every week. The one he just had in week 12 was his very first touchdown since week 2, and he has no games this year with over 15 targets. Now he gets a matchup going up against Atlanta. They allow the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This offensive line is still destroyed in New York. Tim Boyle last week was running for his life. He has no time in the pocket. He was sacked 7 times in week 12 alone. Wilson is the current wide receiver 25 overall in fantasy football, and honestly, that's kind of where I see him hovering around rest of season. A top 25 to 30 wide receiver with a decent floor but a limited ceiling. The quarterback play is just too bad to put him any higher, and my rankings come out, he's probably going to be somewhere in that 25 to 30 range again. Which will then take us out to Pittsburgh for a matchup between the Steelers and the Cardinals. And for Hollywood Brown, it was great to see the volume return in week 12. That was his first game with double-digit targets since the return of Kyler Murray, but also his first game in double-digit targets since week 6. Unfortunately, A lot of these targets that he's seen, though, they're just not catchable. His current catchable target rate on the season is 59.3%. If you don't know what that means just under 60% of the targets he sees are even deemed catchable. That number right there is good enough to be wide receiver 94 on the season. That's just not great. Now, I do like that he does lead this team in targets, and they're a team that's losing quite a bit, so they're going to throw the ball quite often, but we're also starting to see the reemergence of Big Dortch energy, Greg Dortch in this offense more and more each week. He's now had back-to-back games here with 8+ targets, and we know that Kyler Murray likes to look his way. But now a matchup going up against Pittsburgh. They allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and rookie wide receiver Michael Wilson is still questionable to play this week after missing the last couple of games. Now, given the decent matchup, I kind of look at the Cardinals wide receivers as flex plays at best. Wide receivers that are not going to be inside my top 24 due to their potential low floors. Let's not forget that Hollywood Brown, even though he saw a huge target share in week 12, only had 46 yards receiving in the 2 games combined before week 12. We need to make sure we temper our expectations and not just automatically throw him too high in the rankings. There's still a lot of risk associated with him. How about for the Steelers? Now, speaking of tempering expectations, the Steelers just continue to be weird as hell in Pittsburgh, right? They're coming off their best offensive game in years, and no wide receivers on this team had over 60 yards receiving or a touchdown. Pickens, he hasn't scored over 10 fantasy points in a game since week 7. Deontay hasn't done that since week 9, and he's all over the field, acting like there's 30 other places he'd rather be. Now, neither wide receiver here in Pittsburgh is averaging over 10 fantasy points per game. The touchdowns, they just aren't there. Pittsburgh is the 5th lowest scoring team overall in the NFL, but here we are staring at another good matchup with some underperforming offensive weapons. Arizona allows the 15th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but in reality, they're only 2 points per game away from giving up the 7th most. That's how close a lot of those teams are. But we also have to bring up the fact that Kenny Pickett is not 100% healthy. He's on the injury report right now and questionable to play due to an ankle injury, not even getting in full practices. I'm sorry, but when you have a below average quarterback, they kind of need to practice. Now, due to this matchup alone against Arizona, and given the fact that it's at home in Pittsburgh, both these wide receivers and George Pickens and Deontay Johnson are going to be verge top 30 for me in my rankings. But I can totally see it here this week. A big touchdown to George Pickens, I think it could happen against this Arizona defense, so when my rankings come out, Pickens will be higher than Johnson. But now we head out to Tennessee for the Titans and Colts. We'll kick it off in Indianapolis first because I don't know if I've ever been more right and wrong about a player in the same week as I was about Josh Downs last week. I love the potential of Josh Downs last week. I wanted to start him everywhere I could, and he got a great opportunity. He had 13 targets. He got what I was looking for. But he only turned it into 5 catches for 43 yards. So if you started Josh Downs because of me, it's my bad. But full disclosure, I love both him and Michael Pittman once again this week. Pittman, we already know, is basically a must-start at this point, averaging over 12 fantasy points per game, one of the more safer and consistent wide receivers in fantasy football. But now a matchup going up against Tennessee, they allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Plus, the Colts just lost Jonathan Taylor, so you have to expect they're going to throw the ball maybe just a little bit more going forward. But we all know that Michael Pittman's going to be the safest option in this passing game, probably going forward rest of season. He's hovering right around 10 targets per game, and he's had 8+ receptions now in 5 of the last 6 games he's played. Downs on the other side, a little bit more of a high upside flex at best in a good matchup this week. Sometimes we just got to remember that when it comes to wide receivers in fantasy football, they can't score points without touches, they can't get touches without targets, and if 13 targets last week was any indication of where Josh Downs is going, he's probably going to be in my top 30 again as well. Now, on the other hand, we got DeAndre Hopkins in Tennessee, and he's out there having a vanilla ice kind of season. Because that huge explosion, that big 3-touchdown game a few weeks ago, looking like a damn one-hit wonder at this point. He only has 10 receptions total over his last 3 games played combined. In fact, he only has 2 games all year long with more than 4 receptions. The volume just isn't there to get excited about starting him weekly. He only has 4 touchdowns total in 2023, and we all know that 3 of them came in just 1 game. Now they're going up against Indianapolis. They allow the 18th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so just under the league average. Now when it comes to injuries, Treylon Burks still in concussion protocol. That dude been in concussion protocol Forever prayers up to Treylon Burks. That has to suck. What's crazy, though, is I continually see DeAndre Hopkins ranked inside the top 20 within the industry consensus, and I really don't understand that for the most part. I don't see him as a weekly top 24 wide receiver. Sure, he's going to have a good game time and again, but in that Tennessee offense, he's not somebody I can rely upon weekly. Maybe verge top 30 at best for me this week. Which will then take us out to Washington for a matchup between the Commanders and the Miami Dolphins. And I don't know if you can tell or not, but I'm already smiling on the inside. These are the types of matchups that we look forward to in fantasy football. A must-win week for so many people, and we get Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle up against this Washington defense. Let's just hope that last week was the kickstart that this duo really needed to get going. We already know that Tyreek Hill been going damn crazy all year long, but last week was only the second week of the season in which Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle both went over 100 yards receiving in the same game. They could definitely do that again this week, though, going up against Washington. They allow the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, despite Tua last week looking like he got bit by a shark, he seems to be good to go. I really view this one as a no-brainer. Both these guys going to be inside my top 12 to 15 on the week, with Tyreek Hill probably sitting at number 1. Now for Washington, not so much. Now they continue to throw the ball crazy each and every week. They continue to fall behind because of their defense, and they have no choice but to throw for all 4 quarters. Typically, that's what you really look for in fantasy football. The issue here is they don't have any type of consistency to any one wide receiver on their roster. Terry McLaurin continues to see the most targets, but hasn't had over 75 yards receiving in a game in 5 weeks. Jahan Dotson, he scores the occasional touchdown, but his volume is minuscule at best. And then you have Curtis Samuel, and all he ever does is the occasional boom or bust. Had a huge week 12, but don't forget, only had 11 yards receiving total in the 2 games prior to week 12. Now they get a matchup going up against Miami, though. They allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I think we all think that Miami is going to get a lead early in this game, and once again, Washington is going to have to play catch-up. I kind of see Jalen Ramsey going the way of Terry McLaurin. Dotson and Samuel could definitely see an uptick in targets, but none of them are safe this week. We cannot count out the fact that this offense continues to use the likes of Logan Thomas, Antonio Gibson, and Brian Robinson at times in the passing game. This is still a fantasy nightmare to try and figure out in Washington. Given all the information, given the matchup, if I had to choose one wide receiver that I felt was safest this week, I would have to go with Curtis Samuel. I could definitely see him racking up some receptions underneath, trying to extend drives. May not be a huge week, but he could see the most volume. Which now takes us out to Houston for the Texans and the Broncos. And for Denver, I was getting comments last week on how I was disrespecting Courtland Sutton because I had him ranked a little bit lower in week 12 going up against Cleveland. Now, maybe I'm mistaken. You can let me know down below in the comment section. I feel like I've been pretty pro Courtland Sutton majority of the year. I absolutely love the guy, but I'm not blind to matchups either because they actually matter in fantasy football. And then week 12 happened. Courtland Sutton had 3 catches for 61 yards and no touchdowns. And I'm not panicking about it. Why am I not panicking? It's because it was expected. And he's still the only wide receiver in Denver that actually matters. I've been saying all year long, if this guy could get 8+ targets week in and week out, he would be a top 12 fantasy wide receiver for the season. I don't know how that's disrespecting Courtland Sutton. If anything, maybe the play calling. Now they get a matchup going up against Houston. Now, not the greatest of matchups, not the worst of matchups. Houston allows just under the league average in fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but Courtland Sutton is a touchdown machine. Touchdowns in 8 of the 11 games this season, but he only has seen 10+ targets in 2 games all year, and that's the head-scratching part. If I had a touchdown guy like that on my team, he would be getting all kinds of opportunities. Something similar to maybe like Michael Pittman in Indianapolis. Let's get that kind of volume going the way of Courtland Sutton, and I guarantee you he's up there inside the top 12. Denver just refuses to feature him that way, though, and maybe that's what the bigger problem is here. But in this matchup, more than likely, he's going to be somebody back up inside my top 20 overall wide receivers, and a guy that I don't mind starting here in week 13. But what about on the Houston side of the football? Who at the beginning of the season would have thought that the Houston Texans would have 2 wide receivers inside the top 17 overall wide receivers in fantasy football heading into week 13? Now look around you. Everyone with their hands up, damn liars. But Tank Dell, been absolutely crushing it with the volume he's getting. Nico Collins, absolutely crushing it. Noah Brown, still not 100% healthy, so we got plenty of targets to go around. CJ Stroud, still crushing it. So what out there leads anyone to believe that this isn't going to continue once again this week against Denver? Well, Denver doesn't necessarily suck anymore. They allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and they are playing great right now. I honestly think that Tank Dell continues to eat once again this week. I know he popped up on an injury report, but don't worry about it yet. If all of a sudden he's questionable heading into the weekend, then we can panic. Midweek, the guy's getting some rest. But Nico Collins, on the other hand, I'm a little bit more worried about because I do expect him to see a little bit more Patrick Surtain this weekend. And Surtain has been damn near shut down for multiple weeks in a row here. In fact, he hasn't allowed over 65 yards receiving to a wide receiver since week 3, and that was against Tyreek Hill and that huge offensive explosion. Now, does this mean I want to sit Nico Collins? It's really going to depend on your other options, but I will tell you this, he'll be ranked much lower than Tank Dell and really on the verge of making the top 30 here this week. Which takes us out to Tampa Bay for the Bucs and the Panthers. And is anyone out there excited to see this Carolina offense after the firing of head coach Frank Reich and assistants Josh McCown and Deuce Staley? Yeah, I'm not really overly excited either. They still have the problems that they had last week. They have a quarterback that is not ready for this level. Yes, I said it. I'm sorry. They have an offensive line that can't block for crap, one of the worst overall run games in the NFL, and only one wide receiver that defenses really have to pay attention to. Maybe we see Bryce Young as a little bit more of a gunslinger going forward because, WTF at this point, right? Because this matchup is pretty good going up against Tampa Bay. They allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Over the last month of the season, this offense, though, has taken a top 12 wide receiver in Adam Thielen and turned him into something that resembles a wide receiver you'd find in New England. Look at the production last week for Adam Thielen. 3 targets, 1 catch, and 2 yards. Come on, that is absolutely ridiculous. Now, given the matchup and how seats are burning right now in Carolina, you have to think that they try to open up this offense a little bit more to at least appease the fan base at this point. Adam Thielen is no longer a top 12 wide receiver for me, but he probably will be just inside my top 24. I know a lot of people out there want to know about Jonathan Mingo, and I love Jonathan Mingo as a prospect, but really until we see more in this offense, they can't supply 2 wide receivers. They have a hard enough time supplying 1. And the downside to that is if they really start using Mingo a little bit more, all that's going to do is take away from the potential ceiling of him and Adam Thielen. It's a lose-lose situation from a fantasy football perspective. All right, what about Tampa Bay? Someone who will be in my top 12 once again is Mike Evans. The dude just continues to be unstoppable. He is on a mission to prove that Tampa Bay's front office made a mistake this offseason when they chose not to extend him. He's had at least 87 yards receiving or a touchdown now in 6 straight ball games. Tough matchups, easy matchups. It doesn't really matter because Baker Mayfield is out there force-feeding targets to Mike Evans weekly. Chris Godwin, on the other hand, he's basically out there playing the sidekick role. I mean, he's not doing a whole lot. He's only had 3 games all season long in which he scored over 10 fantasy points. But now a matchup going up against Carolina isn't some easy matchup. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And we also need to pay attention to Baker himself. He's actually on the injury report right now. He suffered an ankle injury in week 12. Now, all signs are pointing to him being okay and on the field here in week 13, but definitely something to pay attention to. Evans is just another one of those wide receivers that a lot of people faded this offseason, and another one that we didn't. Let's continue to ride the hot wave and keep Mike Evans in all of our lineups. Which will take us over to LA for the Rams and the Cleveland Browns. And for Cleveland, if I'm being completely honest here, I'm not really interested in anyone here in Cleveland. DTR right now currently in the concussion protocol. We have no idea who's going to start at quarterback, and Amari Cooper himself suffered a rib cage injury in week 12 and is questionable to play. I really don't think we're at a part of the fantasy season where we really want to trust an underproducing wide receiver like Elijah Moore with an unknown quarterback, especially if the quarterback turns out to be Joe Flacco. Remember, Elijah Moore and Joe Flacco were teammates with the Jets a couple years ago. Joe Flacco didn't look for Elijah Moore back then. I don't expect him to now. But now they get a matchup going up against the Los Angeles Rams, and they allow a little bit less than the league average in fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But maybe we could consider Elijah Moore if it wasn't for the fact that David Njoku and Cedric Tillman have gotten bigger roles in this offense here as of late. It's like taking a small pizza and splitting it between 4 grown men. It's not enough to fill them up. They're still going to be hungry at the end of the day. And when you take a low volume passing offense and try to split up targets, it's just not going to work, especially when the number one guy is the one dealing with the injury. It just leads to a lot of risk in fantasy football. Now, if word comes out end of the week that Amari Cooper is 100% full go, and that even if it is Joe Flacco playing quarterback or it's PJ Walker, then I'll be okay with Amari Cooper. But until we know he's 100% healthy, I'm probably not risking it. All right, how about LA, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, and the disappointment continues for both of these guys. It is obvious that they are not 100% healthy, but like we said last week, they really didn't need them to beat Arizona, and they proved that. Tyler Higbee and Kyron Williams was more than enough, but now they get a tough matchup going up against Cleveland. Kupp hasn't scored over 6 fantasy points in a game since week 6, and Puka himself has scored under 6 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games as well. But sitting them is always super tough to do. You have to go into that accepting the fact that there's a chance that they could go off on your bench. Now, maybe you have some better, safer options. I totally get it. But the last thing you want to do is start that better option, let the games play out, have one of these guys go off, and then you go out there and say, I knew I should have started so-and-so. Because if you knew it, why didn't you do it? I don't care what YouTube channel you watch, what articles you read, what you listen to in a podcast. None of us see the future. If you have a gut instinct on a player, put him in your lineup. But you also have to know this is not the easiest matchup for these guys. Cleveland allows the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Honestly, I can't look at Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua as top 24 options right now in fantasy football. Now, does that mean they are must-sit players? No, but they're not must-start players either. If it's my team and I have either one of those guys, I'm basically locking them into my flex spot. And they will remain there unless I have other options on my bench that I kind of view as guaranteed, safer, better upside plays. We're getting close to the fantasy playoffs, and the last thing you want to do is get too cute and sit some studs, have them go off on your bench, and have that be the reason you missed your fantasy playoffs. I get that it's not an ideal situation right now, but it is what it is, and there's nothing that you or I can do about it in LA. Which is then going to take us down to San Francisco and Philadelphia, my Manscaped matchup of the week. Now, if you've been here for any length of time, you know we've had these Manscaped matchups for like 3 years now. I guarantee some of you out there have contemplated whether or not you should actually check it out or not. But what are you really waiting for? Are you afraid you're going to find something you actually need? Because I guarantee there's something on that site for everyone. Even if it's not for yourself, it could be for a significant other, a friend, a family member, whoever it may be. But things are too damn expensive out there to pay full price, so use referral code HEADLINERS at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. It's not like we're asking for before and after pictures from whatever product you buy. I promise your secret is safe with us. And who knows, the laughs that it could bring on a Christmas morning are going to be something that you never forget. But now let's talk about this matchup because, oh baby, this one is going to be fun to watch. It's a matchup basically filled with a bunch of no-brainers, right? All 4 of these guys are averaging over 11 fantasy points per game. Both defenses are in the top 12 for most fantasy points per game allowed to opposing wide receivers. Both teams are overly healthy, with the exception of Dallas Goedert there in Philadelphia, which is fine because that actually helps Devontae Smith. Both of these offenses are tied for 3rd in the NFL in scoring. Both teams are led by top 12 overall fantasy quarterbacks. Both teams are way easier to throw on than they are to run on. Do you kind of see where I'm going here? From a fantasy wide receiver standpoint, I could see a bunch of scoring from all of these guys on both sides of the field. There's a reason I made this one my Manscaped matchup of the week. It's because Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, A.J. Brown, and Devontae Smith are all top 24 wide receivers and guys who should be in your lineups this week. Now we go out to Green Bay for the Packers and the Chiefs, and look at that. I hit my whack-a-mole from last week. I picked in last week's video Rashee Rice to be the one guy in Kansas City that I would go with if I had to. And what do you know? He had his best game of the season. It's really not rocket science, right? You give that guy volume, you're gonna get production in return. It was his first game all season long in double-digit targets, his first 100-yard receiving game of the season, and now has touchdowns in 3 of his last 5 games played. Whatever that was in week 11 that we saw with Justin Watson and all that crazy usage, I'm glad it's over with. But now they get a matchup going up against Green Bay, who allows the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But just like most of the season right now, Jair Alexander is questionable and still not practicing for Green Bay, so that's definitely going to help out. Kadarius Toney, Jerick McKinnon on the Kansas City Chiefs side of the football, they're questionable to play as well. But that really leads me to wanting to make a statement here in week 13. Rashee Rice will be the only wide receiver that I care and talk about going forward in Kansas City. He will be ranked in that wide receiver 25 to 30 range every single week until we can start to see a little bit more consistency, which is basically making him a weekly high upside, high risk flex for whoever may need one. He is not some weekly absolute must start, but he does have enough of a ceiling now in an offense that desperately needs playmakers to be somebody that we consider weekly as a flex play. All right, how about for Green Bay? And this passing game right now is just working. Jordan Love is playing great, which is great because we can't get a running game in Green Bay because A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones can't stay healthy. But that really helps us from a fantasy perspective because that means we're going to need to throw the ball a lot. The problem is we have way more than just one guy to throw to. Jayden Reed has been the most consistent wide receiver in Green Bay. He's had over 10 fantasy points now in 4 of his last 5 ball games. Romeo Doubs, he scored over 10 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3, but Christian Watson is coming off his best game of the season with 5 catches for 94 yards and a touchdown. But now they get a matchup going up against Kansas City, who allows the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but we have another wide receiver joining the mix, a guy who I honestly really like. Dontavian Wicks should be back this week, and that's going to complicate things here just a little bit. I still feel most confident in Jayden Reed in this offense each and every week, but I kind of put him in the same basket as I would a Rashee Rice, one of those guys that I'll kind of lock in from wide receiver 24 to 30 or so as a weekly flex play. I do see Kansas City trying their best to limit any big plays going down the field to Christian Watson, and Romeo Doubs and Dontavian Wicks are basically going to be fighting each other for targets. As of right now, I don't want to discount this as a road game in Kansas City either, but Jayden Reed is probably the safest option going forward in this offense. If you want to just put your nuts on the table and hope for a big day, that's when you kind of go Christian Watson, but you got to know that the floor is super low. Which only leaves us Monday Night Football, a matchup between the Cincinnati Bengals and Jacksonville Jaguars. We'll kick it off in Cincinnati, and let me start off by thanking quarterback Jake Browning for at least keeping Jamar Chase as a fantasy viable option in Week 12. But if you haven't already, it's time to accept the fact that the ceiling of Jamar Chase with Jake Browning is drastically lower than that of what it was with Joe Burrow, kind of comparative to Garrett Wilson at this point of the season. There's going to be fewer touchdowns to go around, and we need a ton of volume. But the problem is, not all volume is quality volume. Plus, there's a chance that we get T. Higgins back this week. I know that doesn't overly excite a lot of people, doesn't really excite me either. But what that could do is really lessen the overall target share going the way of Jamar Chase. Now, Jacksonville is way easier to throw on than they are to run on. They allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, with the way that this Jacksonville offense has been playing as of late, I see them scoring early in this ball game, forcing Cincinnati to have to play catch up and throw the ball all 4 quarters. With that being said, and with Higgins potentially coming off an injury, I'm really only considering Jamar Chase this week, but he's not going to be a top 12 wide receiver for me. Maybe top 15 to 20 or so. I'm just hoping that he can go out there and get at least 10 targets this week. Similar to what we see with Garrett Wilson. Force feed him targets, give him that safer floor, and hopefully he doesn't burn us. What about for Jacksonville? And Calvin Ridley is currently going streaking. That's right, back-to-back big games. But you know what? I want to make it back-to-back-to-back for you. So I went over and I talked to Underdog, and I was like, listen, I want Calvin Ridley to make people a winner once again in Week 13, and they came through. We've been talking about Underdog all season long, and we've been winning tons of money in player pick'ems. But maybe you've sat back and haven't enjoyed the fun with us. But now is the time to do so. Go over to Underdog Fantasy, sign up for a new account, use the referral code Headliners when you do so, and then make the minimum $10 deposit. If you follow those steps, you're going to have basically a free square there with Calvin Ridley, where he only needs more than a half a yard to get you on your way to making you a winner. We have had thousands of people join us on Underdog this season, and we're having a lot of fun with it. Even though the season is almost over, it's not too late. Don't miss out. Come join us over there right now. There's links down below in the description, but be sure to use that referral code Headliners when you do it so you can get this free square. But anyway, back to Calvin Ridley. He's the current wide receiver 21 overall on the season now, and he just missed 20 points in week 12. It would have been back-to-back 20-point games, and that's what people have been waiting for all season long. What it's actually done, though, is forced Christian Kirk to be a little bit more of a safer floor play weekly. Now, that's not a bad thing. Kirk's still hovering right around 10 fantasy points a week, but he hasn't scored over 11 fantasy points in a game since week 7 now. But now they get a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who's right around the league average when it comes to fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This offense, overall, fairly healthy. And with the way the offense is playing and the success that Jacksonville has seen here as of late, you gotta think they want to continue this momentum heading into the playoffs. They're gonna want to show out at home on Monday Night Football, and because of that, both Christian Kirk and Calvin Ridley gonna be inside my top 24 this week. All right, that's going to do it for my wide receiver start and sit video here in week 13 of fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you some information to make your lineup decisions a little bit easier, but don't forget, all day on Thursday, we drop rankings videos. It's running back rankings, wide receiver rankings, quarterbacks, tight ends, and if you're a member of the channel, you also get flex rankings, kicker rankings, defense. Thursday is rankings day, so if you have any final lineup decisions to make, we'll get those covered on Thursday, but I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, don't forget, make the world a better place.